Thank you, Professor Willy Semmler, for hosting and curating this exciting event, and João Paulo Braga and José Pedro Bastos Neves for hosting us so nicely under the wings of SIPA. Today I want to speak a bit about the multiple dimensions of climate justice with a focus on climate justice across countries. And the overall problem of climate change, as we can see here in this graph, the world surface temperature has been rising steadily, but I particularly focus on the inequality inherent in the climate change problem. For one, on the societal level, and here I especially think about philosophical and legal foundations in order to find redistribution mechanisms, but also theoretical foundations of taxation. We can say that progressive taxes or consumption taxes are really targeting those that are offsetting climate change with CO2 emissions, and shed light at not placing a heavier burden on already constrained households. Another interesting legal idea is to have a kind of corporate taxation and thereby enact a retroactive taxation method where you could reap benefits from past wealth accumulation. In my research, I particularly focus on the climate justice in between different countries of the world, and thereby I look into macroeconomic modeling in order to inform redistribution mechanisms, and the results that I want to present today are preliminary results in which I show in different indices an interesting new way of a taxation and bond strategy. So when we think about climate justice in between countries of the world, I created this macroeconomic model that looks into climate change induced gains and losses. And I started modeling when you consider that over the world, there are different mean temperatures per country. So you can say, for instance, Canada has a different mean temperature than Mexico, and that holds for all different countries of the world, that there are differences in the mean starting ground on temperature. There are differences in GDP composition. So the three pillars of GDP, agriculture, service, and industry, are differently composed within or between countries around the world. And when you think about the economic prospects in terms of there is a peak condition temperature in which the economic factors, agriculture and service and industry sectors can be most productive, then you can calculate how much time ahead countries have around the globe until they reach the peak condition for the GDP productivity, even climate change prospects in the next 100 years. I only show these gains of a warming globe in order to find redistribution mechanisms in order to alleviate climate injustice. And these redistribution mechanisms can be ethically informed by Kant's categorical imperative. You should only engage in an action that you want to have been done to yourself. The New School professor Hans Jonas then extends this onto the entire environment. You should only engage in actions towards the environment that you also want to, where you also want to have the consequences being occurred on you. And John Rawls' veil of ignorance informs that you should only evaluate every ethical predicament behind the veil of ignorance. So you should not consider whether or not you have a gaining or losing economic prospect when evaluating the overall problem of climate change. Economically, we can say that Caldo's compensation criteria also offer a solution to redistribution. Caldo writes that only that countries, when they see the entire problem, they can, if the winners compensate the losers and everyone agrees that everyone is better off in terms of the social welfare, then that also puts society at a higher level. I want to show in my results also redistribution mechanisms. I have this novel idea of a taxation and bond strategy in 4 different indices that phase in climate economic gains and losses. I also phase in climate flexibility as the range of temperature variation a country can have. This I see as a future trade asset, climate future wealth of nations climate trade asset, which is heavily informed by the political economy sources that I got exposed to at the New School. Then CO2 emissions as the cause of climate change is one input factor for my indices, and the CO2 emission changes over time. And overall, I also want to integrate historically grown access to capital in the bank lending rates. So look at the results so far. So my input variables are the mean temperature around the globe, the GDP composition per country, the peak temperature for productivity per GDP sector. And here I calculated actually linear prospect and hyperbolic gains and losses around this peak condition, and then took the mean because it's not so clear from the literature if 1 degree temperature change will change gains and losses in a linear prospect or hyperbolic function, and the change of climate over time. And my output variable, what I see then is the time ahead or past from the peak temperature condition for economic productivity throughout the world. As you can see here in this world map, the greener the country, the more the country is a winner, and the redder the country, the more the country will have run out of time in the next 100 years for productivity dependent on temperature. And green, the yellow countries are the countries around the peak temperature for productivity. And what you see in the bar charts, in the upper bar chart, you see 1/3 of the countries. In the downer part, you see 1/3 of the gains in green. And you see this green bar shifts up, which means that only a few countries in the world will get large gains, whereas the rest of the world will be losing. And already now I find in 181 countries that being a climate change winner is highly significantly correlated with self-reported greenhouse gas emissions. And I find climate-induced migration and financial inflow patterns. So this is the inequality part that I'm worried about, that the countries that are gaining or have a rising economic prospect in light of climate change are also the countries that are emitting more CO2s and that get already now human capital inflows and financial inflows. And one more time, I only shed light at this prospective economic gains from a warming globe in order to find redistribution mechanisms grounded in ethical and economic foundations of Kant's categorical imperative, Hans Jonas' extension to the environment, Rawls' veil of ignorance, and Caldo's compensation criteria. Here I have the first model of redistribution. I factor in GDP per inhabitant gains and losses. You see the greener countries should be funding the red countries in this scheme. And I can say that especially small nation island states have the worst prospect in terms of GDP per inhabitant losses. So the inequality over inequality, also the countries that are the most under threat of rising sea levels are the ones that have the lowest economic prospect in light of climate change. And now I shift to the redistribution patterns. So I propose 4 indices. The first index takes in climate change gains and loss prospects and CO2 emissions as the cause of climate change. And as you can see here, the red country, China, should be focusing potentially more on a taxation strategy and tax the industries that are emitting CO2 that cause climate change. Also the yellow country, the US, and the light green country, Russia, they should be focusing more on a taxation strategy, whereas in the green country, there should be a redistribution of these economic gains of the CO2 emitting countries. And this redistribution mechanism could be enacted via a global climate change bond for the financialization of climate change mitigation and adaptation. And the greener the country, the more the country should have a positive premium bonds output, so a payment to offset the losses in these countries that are climate change losers and do not cause the problem. The second index also integrates climate flexibility as the range of temperature zones that a country has. And I see this as a future wealth of nations trade asset. Imagine a country in which you can go skiing and can go to the beach at the same time, offers more in terms of service sector vacation opportunities than in a country that only has one climate zone. And of course, I factor in climate change gains and losses and CO2 emissions over time. And here you see the red and the yellow and the light green countries are advised to have more of a taxation strategy of the CO2 emitting industries, whereas the greener the country, the more the country should become a beneficiary of premium bonds payments of a global taxation and bond strategy. Index number 3 now calculates together the economic gains and losses, CO2 emissions, but also the CO2 emission changes over time. And this is a strategy in order to change the competitive race for cheap production, which runs on cheap energy solutions, to incentivize a race to the top for less and less CO2 emissions and thereby transfer to renewable energy. And here you can see the green country, the US, shifted from being a taxation or a country that's advised to use a taxation strategy to become a green country. I took the data from 2019 and we can say that the US drastically reduced CO2 emissions, and that caused then in this index to the US to shift more into a bonds premium recipient. And the fourth index that I want to present, and here I leave it with, is climate change economic gains and loss prospect model, CO2 emissions that cause climate change, but also integrating historically grown bank lending rates. And this tries to integrate historical differences in finding access to capital for innovation and market transitions. And here you can see again the red and the yellow country is advised, and light green country is advised to use a taxation strategy to fund premium bonds payments in the more green countries that are climate losers with less CO2 emissions and historical hard or higher bank lending rates. And with this, I thank the audience for the attention, and I look forward to Q&A from the audience.